Welcome everybody. And this is a space where if you'd like to be on camera, you can be. We certainly welcome that, and we welcome as things arise and you have questions in the chat. We'll also prompt you at times to ask you some questions, but we certainly welcome your questions, and we'll do our best to answer what we can in the time that we have. And if we can't, we'll make sure we get back to you the best that we can as well. So we really welcome you, and we look forward to kind of digging into some conversation today as well. So what I will say is that we just heard about this idea of collective trauma of many different types and of many different layers. And that is something that is and has been relevant for many groups and for many people across history. But we are at a particular point in time in history where we are navigating both the effects of COVID that are affecting everybody, right? And so we think about our students and our adults in schools, as well as families and community members, along with the many other layers of racial trauma, of disproportionate effects, many of the kind of social disparities and disparities of resources, et cetera, that people are experiencing. And I just wanted to make the connection and the link that, as we have this conversation today, this is a time where the conversation about trauma and social and emotional development has never been more relevant to everybody, right? So we all know it's been relevant to everybody, and I'm sure a lot of you on the phone are totally to choir around that. But I think in some ways this space has felt like there is space for a little bit more thinking about this, both for adults and students. And so feel passionate about all of this. And all three of us, Wehmah, Terrence, and I, are going to talk about that today, and also just talk about the alignment of these things so that it doesn't feel like everything's happening in silos and in different ways. So we're going to talk a little bit about what we mean by at the very least, social and emotional learning and trauma, although there are a lot of other things that can kind of weave in there as well. And then talk a little bit about what that alignment might look like and what it really takes to kind of make this work successful. Terrence, anything else you want to say about that before we start?
I think the thing that you hit on is right on. That for some of us that have been working towards having trauma sensitive spaces for years, once upon a time there was some convincing that we had to do of educators and higher ups, et cetera. And now with all of us having these collective experiences, it's far less of a push for people to see why there's this need. And so it's an opportunity. And I know it's difficult many times for us to think about those cascading traumas as spaces for opportunity. But that's why I'm so happy that Wehmah went through the positives and the negative impacts of those traumas. And it's an absolute opportunity for solidarity and for us to dig into, how can we shift spaces to be better prepared to affirm the humanity, the fullness of humanity of everyone that's in our spaces, whether they're teachers, students, staff, et cetera.
Yeah. Agreed.
Can you all hear me?
Yep.
We can hear you, Wehmah.
Great. I'm sorry. I had to log out and log back in. I did want to officially introduce Terrence before we got started. And he is the co-founder, trainer, and principal consultant at Project Restore Initiative. And he's also the 2019 Search Fellow, an avid researcher, creative youth advocate, and he's trained in the TRHT racial healing as a TRHT racial healing practitioner. Terrence has worked for and alongside students, families, and communities in the Chicago area as an advocate and an educator, and he uses his skills as an instructional designer, a leadership coach and trainer to provide consulting, coaching, and training to schools and districts and companies around creating and sustaining equitable, affirming, healing-centered environment for students and communities. So I did want to officially welcome Terrence and give him the proper introduction. We'll start by briefly just giving an overview of social emotional learning, which I'm sure most people are familiar with. We view it as a process. You can click on the slide. It's an ongoing process that involves practices that promote cognitive as well as social emotional outcomes, and this can include interactions that occur in relationships that form between adults and students and between students and their peers, and these practices happen in and out of the classroom, and the result is the development of competencies. Next slide. And so the competencies that we are most folks are familiar with are the 5 competencies from the Collaborative for Social, Emotional, and Academic Learning, or CASEL, which is one of the leading organizations for SEL research and practice, and those 5 are listed here on the slide. One thing to be mindful of is that the definition of SEL is evolving to include a more specific focus on equity, and so CASEL has recently revised their definition, and the new one highlights the role of SEL in promoting equity in education, the importance of promoting students' personal identity, agency, and sense of belonging in the classroom and in schools and communities, and the integration into broader context. So shifting from a primary focus on standalone lessons and activities and moving to a more integrated systemic approach. Next slide.
So the other end of that we wanted to talk about, so we've already actually talked a little bit about, quite a bit about trauma in the beginning part of this, but in a little bit of a broader way. And so when we think about trauma, sort of zooming in and zooming out, one way to think about it is with sort of the 3 E's, that trauma is both a type of experience, right? So a type of event or series of events or set of circumstances that has a particular quality. And for one, it's experienced by the individual, and that also might include lots of individuals to create a whole, right? But it's experienced by that person as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening. It overwhelms that person's ability to cope. That's a kind of key indicator of what might make something feel traumatic for any of us. And that it does in some ways have effects. It doesn't mean those effects are forever effects, but if we experience something and are pretty much unaffected by it, even in the moment, then our bodies probably didn't experience it as traumatic. So those are just kind of some ways for us to think about trauma. But another, I think, just powerful piece of trauma is how it leaves people feeling. And some key sort of indicators of that are helplessness, vulnerability, and loss of control. And one of the reasons to sort of highlight those things is that those are the very types of experiences we don't want to recreate in our systems when we're looking to avoid kind of recreating or mimicking trauma unintentionally, oftentimes, but in other ways. So we just want to be kind of thinking about that. And then on the next slide, we just really kind of wanted to make the point about the alignment, right? So we know that trauma and experiences of adversity and trauma can really significantly impact social and emotional development. So all those skills and those the CASEL framework and those competencies that we're trying to develop in kids, developing them actually gives kids the tools, ideally, to be able to navigate and cope with adversity. But we also know, especially when overwhelming stressors happen early on in life, during the time when we're trying to develop those skills, it can really derail in some ways for some kids and into adulthood for some adults, that's those skills and those capacities, including things like self-regulation, self-awareness, social engagement, and relationship building, and even just those higher level executive functions like how we attend to information, make decisions, assess situations. It can really affect that in ways that we can even see into adulthood in some circumstances. So there's so much of alignment and connection between adversity and resilience and the social and emotional skills that we need to sort of navigate all of that. Next slide. So I'm sure you could all answer this question on today's conversation, but there are a number of different reasons why schools are addressing trauma, and I think still a good question to ask, because this isn't traditionally where schools live, right? In terms of how we see our mission, how we see our work. But one of the things that is very clear is that unaddressed trauma really does negatively impact learning and academic success, right? So even if that's your ultimate goal as your system, trauma is a barrier, or unaddressed trauma anyway, is a barrier to achieving that mission. It is also the case that, and this is not just in schools, in many systems, but we really risk both misunderstanding, mislabeling, in clinical settings, misdiagnosing, and in a lot of ways, re-traumatizing kids if we don't understand what kids have experienced, how it's affecting them, and how their responses might be related to trauma, and not knowing how to help them effectively. We also know that schools can play a role in prevention, right? And in mitigating those negative effects of trauma. Another thing we're going to talk about today is educator trauma. Trauma is insidious, and its effects can sometimes move through systems in ways that we aren't fully able to recognize in the moment. But they are affecting us. They're affecting our pace. They're affecting our staffing, they're affecting our job performance, it's affecting our morale. And we know that, while there's still a lot more, I think, exploration to be done about this, we have seen some real promise around the ways that addressing trauma can positively affect students and families and staff and schools. So I just wanted to say, on the next slide here, what we're meaning contextually today when we're talking about it, because sometimes people talk about trauma-informed, or they talk about trauma-informed, trauma-sensitive, trauma-responsive, trauma-engaged. There are lots of different ways that people talk about it. Sometimes when they use especially trauma-informed, I find that sometimes people mean tier 2 or tier 3 clinical interventions, and I call that sort of small t trauma-informed, and sometimes people say trauma-informed and they mean capital T, meaning sort of whole system. So in school settings for today, we're going to use the term trauma sensitive because that's the one that more historically has been associated with this sort of universal approach that says we aren't so much focusing on changing kids, we're focusing on changing systems. And then when needed, getting kids really important group and individualized supports to help with healing that can't be done just at a kind of universal with every adult level. But we really are focusing on that sort of universal vision for this, just to kind of set the stage for what we're talking about when we're talking about that today. And I'll just shift it back to Wehmah to help us to kind of think about how we might integrate these things.
Next slide. So recent events have definitely put a brighter spotlight on SEL and trauma, and this represents an opportunity for us to re-examine how to best support students so that they can get the maximum impact from both approaches. And so one of the things that we've seen is that when some schools or districts adopt SEL or trauma-sensitive approaches, they tend to initiate a parallel implementation process. And sometimes when you do that, you risk creating an incomplete understanding of each approach, where maybe people aren't clear about what each means, or sometimes the terms are used interchangeably. You may also risk sending confusing or contradictory messages about expectations for student behavior or how staff should interact with students. There could be a sense of competing priorities. For example, with only so much time in the day, teachers may be unsure about what to focus on or how much time they need to devote to SEL or trauma-sensitive approaches. And there's also the risk of intervention or initiative fatigue. And all of these things lead to fragmented implementation, which means you most likely won't get the results that you want. Next slide. So we're going to talk about these 6 things, which are ways to integrate the two approaches into a cohesive plan. We're going to be looking at building a shared understanding and integrated vision, building readiness, shifting mindsets, supporting adult SEL and well-being, joint implementation, and also the focus on equity. Next slide. And here we've just pulled some of the key elements of trauma-sensitive schools and SEL. The first takeaway is that each approach brings something unique but important to the table, and it's important to understand what these differences are. But the other takeaway is that there are also some shared principles and goals that can be used as a starting point for integration, and that's where the circles overlap. And you'll see creating a safe and supportive environment, developing positive relationships, empowerment, cultural responsiveness, and well-being are all places where the two overlap. Next slide. Another important factor to consider for integration is readiness. So when we talk about readiness, we're basically looking at the extent to which there's motivation, capacity, and momentum to implement a specific intervention or approaches. And motivation can be influenced by many different things. So, for example, it could be the extent to which educators see the new approach as being better than what they're already doing or what's already in place. Is it consistent with current values and norms of the school? Is it understandable and easy to implement? And are there observable results? You also have to assess capacity. There's the general capacity. How well is the school or district functioning? Is there a strong foundation in place? And then the intervention-specific capacity, which reflects knowledge or skills that are specific to SEL and trauma sensitivity. And then, of course, momentum always helps. And there's momentum based on buy-in, some of the activities, and the current climate. And, you know, as we know right now, and I mentioned before, given everything that's going on, there's certainly a growing momentum around the work that many schools and districts were already doing around SEL and trauma. And so I do want to pause for a second and bring Terrence into the conversation before we move into mindset shifts in adult SEL to share some insights about the general impact of readiness in the schools and groups that you've worked with.
Absolutely. One of the things, just hearing you talk about motivating factors and where there might be capacity and how we need to assess before we begin to really combine SEL and TSA in a way that is substantive and a way that's transformative. And sometimes it involves in the practices that I've engaged with. Let me stop by sharing. Before I ran Project Restore Initiative, I was a schoolhouse educator for almost 13 years. And as a high school administrator, most of my work dealt with culture, school culture, behavior, discipline, et cetera. And so this space is kind of like, this is my comfort space. And I've had to actually combine these tools and not even see them as tools. Originally, when I first came into education, we looked at SEL as a tool. We looked at, then it was trauma-informed care as a tool. And we would always say, okay, we're going to pull these tools out of our toolkit to apply these tools to specific needs of children or communities. And as I matured in my understanding of the concept of social emotional learning and creating trauma-sensitive spaces, I recognize that these can't just be tools that we pull out when it's, they're not a ratchet, right? It's really about a way that we begin to engage with community culture, collective well-being, et cetera. The training that Wehmah just gave us, or the information that Wehmah just gave us about cascading trauma and collective trauma, you have to ask yourself, well, what is the response to that impact? What is the response to that trauma? And what I found is collective well-being. And so my work in engaging readiness in a lot of the schools has involved helping schools to begin to figure out, and districts to figure out, what is it that you want? What do you want the community avatar to be for your spaces? And how do you want your spaces to inspire your stakeholders? If your parents, your students, your staff, when they engage with your schools, when they engage with your districts, what feelings, what affirmations do you want that engagement to inspire? And so one of the ways that we begin to assess readiness when we support schools is we come in and we do a participatory equity scan. And that scan involves us actually engaging with families, community orgs that support the school, students, and all of the staff to begin to ask, how is the space that you're in? What are the needs of this space that you're in? What are the ways in which this space could grow? And what that's begun to do is it's really built buy-in. Because after we get that participatory data, we then work with that school or that district to develop an equity action team where we begin to ask, work with that team to figure out what are the areas where we need to continue to build capacity, build competencies, as Wehmah spoke to, and what are things that just could be initiatives. And when it comes from the people, when it comes from the families, when it comes from the teachers, that helps support that buy-in, and it helps you to really get a true understanding of gauging the readiness. I've done it both ways. I've done it in a schoolhouse where, we go to a conference and you find something that's just, world-changing to you, and then you come back to the schoolhouse and you say, we're gonna do X, and you guys are gonna jump on board. And most of you in here that have done that as well, that is a hard pull and that's a hard sell, right? But when you're able to engage through that participatory model, you're able to shore up that understanding of readiness and get that buy-in that you need to make sure that it's felt as a collective initiative and a collective movement in the culture, and not just a top-down tool that's being pushed onto educators.
Yeah, that makes sense. I just will also say, Terrence, I'm curious, there's always sort of we'll never be fully ready, right? Like, so at some point you have to dive in, but I am struck by the importance when thinking about readiness to all the motivation that you're talking about, and people seeing it as their own, but also looking at realistically how your school is currently functioning.
Exactly.
Because if there's a lot of distrust, if there's a lot of challenge, if there's a lot of, for lack of a better word, sometimes places it might be toxic, it might be, just culture, morale might not be great. It's really hard to embody social and emotional competencies and trauma sensitivity if the school itself isn't even ready to kind of take that on. So that's an interesting challenge, I think, too, that sometimes people find themselves in. I was just curious your thoughts.
With almost every client, we find ourselves in the same challenge, right? And so one of our approaches to social emotional learning is that we see the development of a culture of SEL and TSS as directly connected to developmental relationships. And when you're talking about distrust, when you're talking about toxicity, those are all constants, are all things impacting relationships, birthed from relationship. Either my relationship to my colleagues, my relationship to policy, my relationship to those that lead the space, school district, et cetera. And so because we see it through that lens of relationships, when we're coming in and doing these scans, it's not just, hey, do you feel this space is equitable? It's, it's how do you engage with your staff? How do you engage with students? Do you feel that this is a safe, brave space? And beginning to do that pre-work, most times it ends up providing us with information, one, on what is the true nature and culture of how the staff engages with one another, or how even the departments might engage with one another. And it also begins to give us more information on those areas for competency building. And what we found is before we're able even to get into the SEL conversation, we tend to have those greater conversations about developmental relationships, around communication, around microaggressions, around all those things that can get in the way of us beginning to come together and build the culture that's necessary to begin to shift culture in our networks or our schools. And that's also a space where we rely on narrative therapy. We see we always see participatory research as an extension of narrative-based change, but we also do rely on narrative therapy. And the key practice of narrative therapy that we use when we come into these spaces is, Wehmah talked about me being a TRHT racial healing practitioner. And so we use TRHT methodologies with our schools. And we begin to get staff members to have conversations across their affinity, across their difference, whether that difference is based hierarchical or personal identity, and they begin to really connect to their interconnectedness as humans, because ultimately that's the point. The point of creating a space that has begun to meld together social emotional learning and trauma sensitive spaces is well-being. Human well-being, that the humans that are in these spaces can thrive, that the humans that are in these spaces can do the things that are in them to do. We know that every child that sits in the seats that we serve, that we're not imparting wisdom and genius in them, we're helping them to reveal their wisdom and their genius. And if there are things getting in the way of that revelation, then our process is tainted. And we need to cleanse that process by building stronger relationships and seeing ourselves as connected as humanity. And so that's definitely something that we face often when we get into that readiness conversation and building those plans. But we take that approach that it really breaks down to strong developmental relationships and how we can begin to foster those regardless of your position in the ecosystem.
Yeah, thank you. And we're gonna move through into a couple of other conversations here that I think are just gonna build on what you're saying. But I just want to say there's a question in the chat about, is there pre-work you're encouraging before consultation? And I think, Terrence, you're talking about some of that pre-work now. And I think it's also just a great question about if you're thinking about consultation in 2021, 2022, even during this sort of remote and hybrid time, when I actually think relationships are a bit more fractured in a lot of different ways, even among staff. That's maybe, I think there's pre-work that you've maybe already spoken about, Terrence. It feels to me like the tilling of the ground. Yep. Are some of the things you're saying. And it feels like, yeah, I'll see if you have anything else to say about that. And then let's shift to the next slide, because I think mindset conversations are part of that tilling as well. Although I don't know if I would call that pre-work, I would call it part of the work. Yes. But let me know, Terrence, if there's anything else you want to add there.
I mean, there's always, of course, when we come in to support in that way, our end result with that particular practice that I was talking about, that particular model, our end result is to develop a professional learning plan to help build capacity in those spaces. So there is that pre-work of that process of beginning to engage with those different stakeholders. We do surveys, one-on-one interviews, focus groups, et cetera, to get the data that we need to build a report that says, hey, this is what the community, students, staff, et cetera, is saying the needs are of this school or this district, and this is what we're going to work towards as an action team. But pre-work in general is just getting with those school leadership team members or those district or network level leadership team members and asking, specific questions. What are you doing to humanize your space? What are you doing as it relates to collective care? What are you doing as it relates to support for your youth and your teachers? And the answers to those questions give us a lot of insight to know, hey, what direction do we need to go as far as how we'll prescribe support, how we'll continue to engage. And then someone asked in the chat, I know I speak very fast because I'm used to saying TRHT. It stands for Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation. And that methodology was developed by Dr. Gail Christopher in collaboration with the W.K. Kellogg Foundation. And yesterday we celebrated our 5th annual National Day of Racial Healing, which involved racial healing circles all across the country, several hundred here in Chicago, but there are 14 TRHT cities throughout the country. And so that is the TRHT is the name of the healing methodology.
Great, thank you. Let's shift to the next slide, because this is another place where it felt like we have some questions for you all. And we'd like to sort of spend a little bit of our time on that. And so one of the things that we've been thinking a lot about, and others have as well, is one of the strategies for supporting the integration of these pieces successfully is the shifting of mindsets. And one of the things that we've found is there's a real legitimate urgency for strategies and practices and things that people can integrate immediately. And that's totally understandable. The concern being if the practices aren't informed by a certain way of kind of thinking, then it becomes sort of, what do I do? What do I do? But maybe the question rather should be, how do I be? And so I think the mindset shifts are an interesting way to kind of also, as part of preparing people or even gauging, part of the work is really thinking about how do we shift our system from a more traditional sort of perspective that yields very particular behaviors, right? To a more trauma sensitive, SEL, restorative type of perspective. And so some examples of that are this shift from judgmental, I think people have probably heard this a bit before around trauma informed, but sort of the sort of there's something wrong with you, and the use of negative labels in how we're talking about kids and families and potentially colleagues, to the way of curiosity and really understanding what story, when we think about narrative, right, Terrence, like what story is this behavior telling us? And how might these at times be ways of coping in the best way that we have with situations that we're experiencing, and really thinking about those negative labels. There's this shift from this idea of power over and obedience to power with and collaboration. One of the things that is sort of a bit of a check, I think, sometimes for adults is, are we integrating SEL and trauma sensitive practices because we want more obedience, or because we want kids to actually really grow the capabilities to live their freest, best lives, which doesn't mean always they're going to be easy with in the classroom. So thinking about that shift, this shift from individual to environmental, and that's quite frankly a shift even in the clinical trauma world, right? Like the idea of shifting from a focus on how do we deal with the symptoms to what are the sort of causes of these things, and how do we create systemic responses. The idea of shifting from deficit-based and more reactive to more strengths-based and proactive. So it's less about, well, tell me who the kids are who've experienced trauma and I'll be gentle with them, to more of this idea that there's a way of being with everybody that is good for everybody and is particularly critical for kids who've experienced trauma. And then if you just shift to the next slide, we'll just finish this off and then pause. Also the shift from more punitive to more restorative approaches to, I'm saying discipline here, but also really to relationships. Ideally, restorative isn't just a discipline tool, but is a relational tool, right? From siloed to more integrated, we all have a role to play, right, in supporting both healing and kind of resilience building. The shift from operating from one dominant culture to a position of cultural humility and expansion of who is at the table, and how their voices are heard and what that looks like. And just fundamentally, I think still worth talking about is the shift from an academics only mindset to an academic and social and emotional learning frame, which not everybody is on that train, right? So we just wanted to pause here and really, I think we all have other things we could say about this, but just take just a second to get your read on this. And so one of the things that we were curious about is just, as you look at this, and I know we can't have both the slides up at the same time, so we can flip back and show you kind of the first one and this one as well, but it's just, what shifts do you see in the context you're in being maybe easier, and what shifts are you thinking? Let's start with what shifts are most challenging to you, do you think, in terms of these mindset shifts? Yeah, Laura, if you could go back and forth, maybe just show the previous slide for a second so people can take that in again. And then, yeah, if you could toggle back and forth, that'd be great. just curious where people are seeing the biggest sort of challenges in shifting from this traditional approach. Yeah, Leslie, okay, so power is a hard one. Moving from all academics, from siloed to shared, power with collaboration, cultural shifts, academics only, cultural humility. Okay. Moving away from punitive discipline. Yeah, that is a challenge. Shannon, it's a really great point, a systemic shift. You can talk to teachers, you can talk to even groupings of teachers, or even sometimes a grade level, and they're doing this, but it's not happening school-wide, right? Or you have pockets of teachers who are practicing this, but it's not consistent and expansive.
Kathleen, I think one of the things that stands out to me in thinking about that statement is that sometimes you have these pockets of teachers that even though they are collaborating in a small group, they're still siloed from the greater school community or greater district community because many times what is considered results or what is considered the finish line or what is considered excellence has not been defined from a space of these more trauma sensitive, or as I like to say, humanized perspectives.
Right.
And everyone is in a different space in their journey as educators. Early on, I was a lot of the left. I was a lot of the traditional perspective as an early educator. And not only was I not finding the connections that I needed with staff, the connections I needed with students, it also was trying. It takes a lot of energy to want to have power over or to remain siloed, to not be collaborative in nature.
How do I mute
I'm sorry.
my webinar?
Hold on a second.
Okay. All good, all good. I thought I did that. I was like, where'd that come from? Nonetheless, I was a lot on the left, and as I matured in my work, I recognized that how I had been conditioned as a student was impacting how I had been conditioned as an educator, and that traditional perspective was not ever, in my opinion, in my professional opinion, was not ever meant for humans, right? It was really built for systems or built for industry. Because if, all of these terms, they fit very well if we're talking about a factory. They fit very well if we're talking about supply and demand. If we're talking, we are imagining that we're all in a Ford factory right now. You want some things to be siloed. You want there to be a response if the person's been late 10 times in a row. Like it works very well. And I had to make a shift in recognizing that I needed to rehumanize my practice. And rehumanize my practice, I often joke when I'm doing trainings, is that if it works for a plant, it probably will work for how you engage with those that you're trying to support. So you want to be restorative. You want to, be responsible. You want to flower and develop a good relationship with it. You want to have reparative notions. And so I had to make that shift in myself and recognize that a lot of what I was doing, particularly in my years when I was a dean of discipline, I was trying to command control, and the goalposts and results were asking me for those types of actions, right? It wasn't how many youth feel restored, affirmed, and safe. It was, what is your number of suspensions versus your number of, large violations, tier 3 violations. And so what had to happen, the last space I was in, is I had to work at the network level in us shifting what the goalposts look like, shifting what it means for someone to do an assessment of the culture of your school, that an assessment is not just how quiet are the classes in the hallways and how straight are the lines, but making sure that an assessment involved, do students feel safe? Do they feel supported? Do they feel seen, right? And realizing that even my work in culture was not just dean work or AP work, that my work in culture was a collaborative effort for all those that I like to call practitioners of well-being. When you said earlier that it's like, how do we be? And I think that is the conversation that we have to have in all of our spaces of education, is are the policies, practices, and goalposts, so to speak, the results that we're looking for, are they a output of being and being well, or are they standing in opposition to being and being well? And I had to make that decision for myself, and then partner with colleagues to begin to evaluate our practices so we can make sure that we can feel good when we say, hey, we have success. That success actually means students are coming out feeling empowered and affirmed.
Yeah.
And I just want to add that because we're often seeking behavior change, the mindset shift has to precede expectations for changes in behavior. And
Yep.
so that means when you're prioritizing or thinking about professional development, this is something that needs to be prioritized. And I did note that others, some folks in the chat box had noted that this professional development needs to start at the teacher training level and not when teachers are already in the classroom.
Cool.
Yeah. Cool. And I think that shifts us maybe, Wehmah, to the next slide, just because it goes, Jessica, you were saying the need for personal internal work, and the idea of starting with the adults, which is one of our strategies, is a paradigm shift.
Absolutely. And I see, when we, earlier we looked at the 5 competencies, and in our trainings for educators and even our trainings for community-based organizations, because we base our work in youth development and recognize that youth are developed everywhere, at the library, at After School Matters, at the After School program. When we're training those organizations, we actually begin our training for youth with adult SEL. And we treat those 5 competencies as ways that adults can begin to not only support their own personal development, but to build those strong developmental relationships among colleagues, with their school leaders, with families, community, et cetera. And it has really supported a shift for the practitioners and educators that we've supported to begin to see themselves differently, to not just see SEL as a tool we apply to children or that we apply to students and their families, but to begin to see, like, I need to be well. And I need, in this time that we're in, dealing with COVID-19, dealing with the cascading traumas that we've spoken about, many of the youth, so to speak, the things that the youth are experiencing, their teachers are experiencing the same things, right? My wife is an educator, I'm an educator. We've had family members that have dealt with COVID. We've had family members that have lost housing and jobs connected to COVID. And so all of us are experiencing these things. So more than ever, you seeing, SEL as something for the adults in your spaces is very important. And, you can integrate it the same ways that you would integrate SEL into, work with your youth. In all of our trainings, we use SEL practices that we integrate into the trainings to make them so normative, right? So normative that we're going to do a check-in, that we're going to engage with you differently in order to make sure the learning is sticky, and that we're going to have some form of ceremonial closing. It's so normal for us to do those practices that it's not even caught that, hey, this is someone that's helping me engage with myself differently, so that I build the practice. And then when I am using these particular practices with the students I serve or in the communities I serve, it's not something I'm doing to someone, right? It's a way of being that already exists in my practice. So it becomes even more simple for it to be adopted by those that are our watchers. We know that the students that we serve, they're our watchers. They're going to learn your bad habits. They're going to learn your good habits. So it's best that you begin to engage with yourself in a way towards your own emotional stability and well-being, and they'll learn those habits too.
Yep. And also important that the systems and structures are in place to allow teachers to be able to do that. Teachers,
absolutely.
Staff. Yeah.
And I know we want to talk about a few other strategies, but I just wanted to mention, when we're talking about adults, in the chat box, you're also bringing up the parent education piece. So Terrence, one of the questions was talking about your experience with parent education and their role as stakeholders in helping to shift culture within a school.
I think what I've seen, and whether it was me in the schoolhouse or me outside of the schoolhouse, the parent role actually begins with the school and how the school sees parents, right? Because how a school engages with and sees parents kind of sets the norms and sets the hue of parent engagement. I've been in spaces where parents are seen as an obstacle to the indoctrination or training of students, right? They've seen as an extension of the students, right? I've been in schools where even the communities our students are come from, they're seen as something that we want to get them away from, something we want them to overcome, right? Rather than seeing our students as uniquely and deeply connected to their communities and their parents, and seeing them as one package. There's a separation. So the first thing I always say when we talk about engaging parents and developing their skills and their competencies is, are we engaging parents from a deficit mindset, right? Are we seeing them as collaborators that we stand in solidarity with for community well-being and the well-being of their youth? Or do we see them as a nuisance, right? And I know that's very direct and might sound harsh, but as a schoolhouse educator, I know if you are in a schoolhouse or near a schoolhouse, you can find a staff member that sees the parent as a nuisance to educating the child rather than a partner and someone that you're in solidarity with. So I think it starts with that. How do we see and engage? And then two, I'm big on participatory mindset. What we'll do is many times we'll say, we think our parents need X. So we're going to provide them with the training on X, and they're going to show up because we're buying meals or we're giving out, Uber Eats gift cards. And what I've found is it's better when we ask the parents, what are you seeing are the needs that you need? What are the things that you're seeing from your student and seeing the community in general? And so I think that is a way that we've gone about engaging with those parents, and then provide trainings. In many of the states that we're in, or in many municipalities that we're in, there's funding even many times for parent-based trainings. And some of the trainings that we give to teachers, we're doing the same trainings with our families and our parents.
Next slide. I want to be mindful of the time, so I won't focus too much here, but this is just some research on educator social and emotional competencies. Next slide.
Sorry, I'm so looking at the chat and wanting to chat with people. So one of the other things that we think of as a strategy here is to really think about joint implementation. So joining teams, right? Joining and developing combined professional development. Terrence, you were really kind of talking about that. Provide combined professional development and implementation. And integrated monitoring and evaluation. And Wehmah, somebody was asking to just see the previous slide once more. Oh, sorry, you're not. Yeah, you're not. And I'll just add, it speaks to Rick, you were saying, so yes, how do we engage with ourselves? And that we work on ourselves first, which is exactly what we've been talking about. And the research on this slide is just one small example of the ways that is borne out. So just wanted to acknowledge that. And then we want to make sure that we wanted to think about joint implementation. That's just sort of a recommendation. Let's not silo these things. Let's understand their differences, but let's bring them together so that we aren't doing this over here with this team and this over here with this team. Let's think about the broader umbrella of humanity, right? Of humanness, of well-being, of whatever that sort of broader umbrella language is that you want to think about and use. And then we just finally wanted to talk about sort of the link to equity, which weaves in with some of what I think was also talked about earlier in the first part of today.
Yep. Next slide. So here we just have a quick definition of equity. It says equity is about fairness. It ensures that each person gets what they need. It's about taking deliberate action to remove barriers and obstacles that hinder overall well-being, and implementing policies, practices, and procedures that are informed by cultural and linguistic competence to promote and facilitate positive outcomes for all. Next slide. And so although well-intended, some equity efforts tend to ignore things like institutionalized privilege and the impacts that it has. And this might inadvertently support inequity and cause students to become disengaged. And so, the most recent incidents of inequities are being highlighted by the pandemic as districts are working to reach all of their students in a distance learning setting and make sure that everybody has all the tools and resources that they need. And you know, of course, we see that this is not the case for some communities. Some communities are definitely lacking in resources, which has always been the case. But this definitely has highlighted it. And so as we think about equity, we need to expand the lens and look at equity in a more robust way in terms of what it means and how to achieve it. And so, you know, this is going to require a concerted effort across multiple systems, and of course, it's not the role of education alone, but as educators, you know, we can do our part, and one of the ways is, like I said, by expanding that lens. And so with regards to SEL and trauma sensitivity, this means grounding the work in the notion that racism and prejudice are just incompatible with trauma sensitivity and social and emotional competencies. It means committing to culturally responsive practices, committing to eliminating inequities that are fueled by systemic trauma. It also means viewing trauma sensitivity and SEL, and I think we talked about this before, not as a means of student confirmation or compliance, but more as a means of supporting students, supporting their agency and voice, and then also equipping people with the skills to actually break down these systems that perpetuate inequities and prejudice. So an example of what this might look like is teaching competencies that are directly related to understanding diversity, honoring different perspectives and identities, social consciousness, conducting trainings on implicit and explicit bias, and also using the trauma lens to not only consider individual traumatic experiences, but to think about the cultural and collective trauma on particular groups and communities, which is how we kind of started the webinar today. And all of these elements can be used as you're developing your integrated vision so that they remain at the forefront of your work. And, you know, I know, Terrence, you've definitely had some experience in terms of the equity piece.
Absolutely. And just hearing you talk about equity, it just is reminding me, and I don't know if we're going to talk about this with the little time we have left, but it just reminds me to remember that, yes, while my name is Terrence Pruitt and I have experienced cascading and collective and individual trauma, I am not that trauma, right? And so there is this balance that we have to have where we are, we're building spaces that focus on how do we affirm the fullness of each person's identity and restore the dignity of their humanity, and pulling down those oppressive spaces where you know, there are targets and agents creating concepts of privilege. We want to do that work, but we have to remember that we cannot begin to pathologize those communities, right? And we have to see those people as fully human people that have an array of experience, an array of joys, et cetera, but that it's all about us being prepared to use this safely and use these particular tools safely. And I, you know, in talks with Kathleen, I often talk about how we use tools connected to literal tools. Like welding is beautiful, right? And it's a beautiful thing, and we can weld a masterpiece together. But if I do not protect my eyes, if I do not protect my hands, protect my body, that tool can be misused and can bring harm. And so one of the ways that we sometimes bring harm in this space is that we begin to pathologize communities as, you know, just what their trauma is. So I think that's a huge part of making sure that we're culturally responsive and building these equitable spaces, is remembering that the end goal is that people should be able to fully be. And they should be able to fully be in a way that produces the results that we want of developing skills, competencies, reaching their goals, graduating from schools and programs, et cetera. But it's not about pathologizing them based on the traumas they've experienced. So that's the thing that kind of jumped out to me.
Yeah, and I wanted to just acknowledge like a couple of good, like Rick, thank you for putting a suggestion book. I have that, actually, Me and White Supremacy. I wanted to, and I'm curious, kind of others' thoughts here. Alex, you asked a great question about, is equity and cultural competency an inherent part of trauma-sensitive practices, or must this be something that is explicitly taught and considered? And the one comment I just wanted to make is that, yes, technically, right? Like when we talk about trauma-sensitive practice, what we're saying is if you're not engaged in the work of equity, and cultural competency, then you're not trauma sensitive. That being said, I think there are a lot of complexities to this conversation, and the trauma world and that work also can be in academia, maybe a very sort of white and Western conceptualization sometimes as well. And I think there are shifts, even with the movement towards understanding the embodiment of trauma and understanding kind of cultural manifestations of both trauma and hope and healing. But what I guess I will say is that when I think, Terrence, about your tool question, maybe it's not inherently, it's a byproduct, but one of the unintended consequences of maybe adopting any of these things, including trauma sensitive practice, in addition to maybe being too deficit based, even though those aren't the core essence, right, of being trauma sensitive, is whether it is a tool for compliance or a tool for liberation, right, which is what you were referring to. And so, and I think it's tempting, though I don't think it's then being done in the spirit that it's intended, to maybe have an end goal or outcome that isn't really aligned with what ultimately we'd want it to be. I'm curious, Terrence, if you have other thoughts about that. I think it's a great question.
I think intent is a powerful space to start at. Intent is a powerful starting line, right? I can intend to get my wife a great present, but I have to center that in her lived experience, in her voice, or I can end up having one of those disappointing moments where you buy your wife something or buy your partner something, and they're looking at you like, thank you, but I don't know what I'm going to do with this bowling gift card, right? And so intent is like our starting space. And I'm with you. Many of us, we're intending to do what's right, to be great educators. We care for students, we care for communities. And so I think it is important that we talk about, is the way that I'm implementing this particular tool, is it towards control? Is it towards dealing with students and communities, or is it towards liberation and standing in solidarity with students and communities? And the way we implement is very important. I can think of a very quick example. Restorative justice and concepts of restorative practice have been implemented in schools since the 70s. And since the 70s, we still see that exclusionary discipline has continued to rise, right? And so we had this tool with us this whole time, and many districts, schools, et cetera, they all will sit to you and a list of all the restorative practices that they're doing while their suspension rates are still climbing, right? While their expulsion rates are still climbing, while Black boys and Black girls are disproportionately suspended and excluded. And so you say, well, what happened? It's really about the failures of implementation. And it's really about getting to those questions of how we develop culture. Do we see ourselves as an extension of the student and their community? Do we see ourselves standing in solidarity with the student and their community towards their ends of success, what they see as success for themselves, what the community sees as success, or do we see ourselves as saviors, or see ourselves in other capacities of wanting to control students and communities? And so it is a mindset shift thing. It is a recognizing that it's not about intent. Many of us are well-intended. I don't think anyone is going to spend their evening on a call learning about trauma sensitivity that's not well-intended, but it's all about that implementation. Is it centered in the affirmation of those that we serve, and is it in solidarity with the voice and lived experiences of those we serve? I hope I answered your question, Kathleen.
Yeah, no, that's great. It's an ongoing point. I want to say hey to Terry, and also just mention her comment about restorative practices are dependent on you having something to restore. Back to Terrence, your point earlier, no relationship, no restoration, no matter who that relationship is with. And then I just wanted to point, Wendy, to your comment also to Alex, that it is very true that these especially racial trauma and other types of historical trauma and collective traumas that we've talked about today need to be woven into a very expansive view of what trauma is. Otherwise, I think trauma trainings can also get caught in just the individual and family-based trauma without zooming out and seeing the feeders to that trauma in other social determinants, et cetera.
And Kathleen, one thing I know we're about to get it's almost over, Laura. But I think that's important too, Kathleen, that we have to remember that because they are systemic traumas, that they can also be traumas that have been experienced by more than one family member. So going back to that little piece of conversation that we were talking about, how we engage with parents. If mom experienced schools that weren't affirming and that caused her trauma, and then daughter experiences, when mom walks into that building, many times the parents that I would have conferences with, they are reliving their experience when they walked into the school, right? And so that's why it's important to zoom out and see it as systemic, because the system has an intergenerational impact on communities.